12 Dancing Princesses. There once was a king who had 12 beautiful daughters. The 12 princesses slept in 12 beds, and each morning greeted the king 12 times. Morning, Daddy. Morning, Dad. Morning, Father. Morning.
Yes, that's enough now, thank you.
But the strange thing was, every morning the princesses' 12 pairs of shoes were found worn through, as if they had been out dancing all night. Yet their bedroom was always locked up tight, and no sounds of dancing were ever heard from within. It was a mystery, and the king was determined to get to the bottom of it.
Let it be known that whoever discovers the secret can choose one of my daughters for his wife.
But there was a downside.
And anyone who tries and fails, well, it's off with their head, of course.
Immediately a brash young prince came forward, certain he could solve the puzzle. A mere piece of cake, sire. The prince was put into a room adjoining the princess's bedroom, where he could hear everything that went on. But before long, he fell into a deep sleep. Next morning, the princess's shoes were found full of holes again, and the prince found that the king kept his promises, even the unpleasant ones. Several other princes came forward to face the challenge, but they too lost their heads. Soon nobody was willing to take the risk, and the king wondered if the mystery would ever be unravelled. Now it just so happened that a soldier was travelling through the kingdom when he met an old woman who asked where he was going. To the palace, my lady, to try my luck at solving this puzzle. Then be sure not to drink any wine the princesses bring you, and pretend to fall asleep. The old woman handed the soldier a cloak. Here, put this on when you follow the princesses. The soldier thanked her, but the woman had already vanished. That night, when the soldier took his place outside the royal bedroom, the eldest princess brought him some wine. How kind, ma'am. The soldier pretended to drink, but not a drop passed his lips. At once the princesses jumped out of their beds and began putting on fine clothes and new shoes. But the youngest princess felt uneasy. Something is wrong, I'm sure of it. The eldest comforted her. What could be wrong? He drank the potion, so he'll be asleep till morning. She clapped her hands, and a trapdoor under her bed opened. Through one eye, the soldier saw the princesses disappearing down a staircase. Swiftly he threw on the cloak and became invisible. Then he followed the princesses. Halfway down the staircase, the soldier trod on the youngest princess's dress. Ah! Someone pulled my gown! Don't be silly, said the eldest. It just caught on a nail. They came out into a glittering grove of trees with leaves made of silver, gold and diamonds. The soldier couldn't resist breaking off a twig. Didn't you hear that? Don't worry, it was just our princes calling us to hurry. They reached a lake where 12 little boats waited, a handsome prince in each one. The princesses stepped into the boats, and the soldier got in with the youngest. As they rowed across the water, the prince struggled with the extra load. Have you been eating more pudding than normal? Certainly not. What a fine way to start the evening. Across the lake was a magnificent castle, filled with light and music. Here the 12 princesses danced the night away merrily with their 12 princes, and being invisible, the soldier danced right alongside them. They danced and danced until the princess's shoes were worn through, and it was time to return home. When they arrived back at the staircase to the palace, the soldier ran ahead. As the princesses came up into their bedroom, they could hear him in the room next door, snoring peacefully. So they collapsed onto their beds and went to sleep. The next day, the king summoned the soldier.
Well, what's the secret? Or are you a sleepyhead like the rest?
The soldier told the king everything he had seen and showed him the glittering twig as proof. The 12 princesses were shocked, but had to admit that every word was true. And so the soldier married the eldest princess that very day. And from that time on, she only wore out her dancing shoes when she danced with him.
The Pot of Gold. In the rolling green hills of the fair Emerald Isle lived a very poor chap called Niall O'Leary. Niall's house was falling to his ears, and his trousers were falling about his ankles. So long it was since he'd had a decent feed. You could have played a ditty on the ribs of Niall's scrawny old horse, if you had a mind to. Now, one fine day, Niall O'Leary set out to look for something to eat. Being an optimistic chap, he hoped for a juicy rabbit or perhaps even some luscious sweet berries. But, as it usually was with Niall, the rabbits were way too quick, and the birds had beaten him by a country mile to the berries. By lunchtime, Niall O'Leary was starting to lose heart. He sat down under a tree to wipe his brow with his handkerchief. And that's when he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. What the blazes could that be? Niall sat very still. He listened hard. Tap, tap, tap. There it was again. Niall peered down into the grass nearby. And what he saw was the tiniest man he'd ever clapped eyes on in all his life, dressed in green from the tip of his toes to the top of his hat, banging away at the sole of one of his tiny shoes. Niall O'Leary rubbed his eyes. A leprechaun. A real live leprechaun. Now, despite being poor, like all Irishmen, Niall knew two very important things about leprechauns. One was that they always had a pot of gold hidden close by, and two, if you caught them and squeezed them very, very hard, they had to tell you where it was. Quietly, Niall eased onto his feet and launched himself through the air. As his giant shadow fell across the grass, the tiny man looked up and took off, and Niall landed with a thud. The leprechaun scampered, and Niall O'Leary scampered right after him. They ran up the hill, they clambered across a river, they rattled through a startled farmer's barn, they ducked under a fence, Niall getting closer with every step until, gotcha! His scrawny fingers snapped tight around the leprechaun's waist.
Take your hands off me, you great lump!
The leprechaun wailed, but Niall O'Leary wouldn't let go. Not till the leprechaun told him where to find his pot of gold.
If I could breathe, I could have some chance to be telling you.
The leprechaun croaked. He promised that if Niall put him down, he'd reveal his secret. Niall smiled the biggest of smiles because he'd heard one other thing about leprechauns, and that was that they could never break their promises. So, ever so slowly, he lowered the tiny, indignant man to the ground. After the leprechaun straightened his clothes, he took a few steps to the left and pointed to the ground at the base of a shrub.
It's right there, but it's buried very deep. You'll not find it without a spade.
Niall O'Leary had no spade. He hadn't set out this morning with digging in mind. He looked left and right. The whole field was filled with identical shrubs. If he went home to fetch a spade, how would he ever find this particular shrub again?
Why not tie your handkerchief around the shrub so you remember where it is when you get back?
Niall O'Leary scowled, suspecting a trick. But the leprechaun raised his hand in all innocence.
I'll not move your kerchief, I promise. And you know we leprechauns can't break a promise.
And so it was that Niall O'Leary bounded home, his head full of all the things he'd do with his pot of gold. New clothes, new house, the biggest party the village had ever seen. By the time he puffed his way back, he knew exactly how he'd spend every last golden coin. As he got to the top of the hill, he saw his red handkerchief fluttering in the breeze. He laughed with glee. The treasure would soon be his, or would it? Nearby he saw another red handkerchief tied around another shrub. Then another, and another. The whole field was filled with fluttering red handkerchiefs tied around every shrub in sight. Niall's face fell in despair. And then across the breeze he heard the wicked laughter of a cheeky and very clever leprechaun running away into the distance. To be sure, leprechauns are very tricky little people, but they're not entirely without heart, because even though Niall O'Leary didn't get his pot of gold, he did come to set up the biggest and best handkerchief store in the whole of Ireland. Rumpelstiltskin. Once there was a very poor miller who was blessed with a very beautiful daughter. One day, the miller went to visit the king to see if his daughter could become a servant at the palace. The king, however, had no interest in very poor millers or their daughters. Next. Desperate to avoid being thrown out the door, the miller burst forth with the first thing that came to his mind.
Did I mention my daughter can spin straw into gold?
Now, that caught the king's attention.
Straw into gold. Bring her to me.
The next day, the miller dutifully brought his daughter to the king. He put her in a room full of straw and gave her a spinning wheel.
Now set to work, and if by tomorrow morning you have not spun this straw into gold, then you must die.
The poor miller's daughter burst into tears. She had no idea how to spin straw into gold. She had no idea how to spin anything at all. All she was good at was being beautiful. Just then, the door opened, and in walked a strange little man.
Good evening, Mistress Miller. Why are you crying so?
The miller's daughter told him of her plight. Then the little man thought long and hard.
What will you give me if I spin the straw into gold for you?
My necklace?
Said the girl.
Very well.
Said the little man. He took the necklace, then sat down at the wheel and set to work, spinning on into the night. The next morning, the king entered the room and stared in amazement. Where once was a room full of straw, now was a room full of gold.
Amazing. Astounding. How did you do it?
Well, it's a long story.
But the king wasn't interested in her story. The sight of all that gold had filled his heart with greed. He took the miller's daughter to another room filled with even more straw. He told her to spin that into gold too, or her life was over. Again she started crying. Then the strange little man appeared.
What will you give me if I spin the straw into gold for you?
The ring on my finger?
So the little man took the ring and began spinning, and by the next morning the room was full of gold. But even that wasn't enough for the king. He took the miller's daughter to an even bigger room full of straw.
If you can spin all this into gold, then you shall become my wife.
Guess what happened next? The little man appeared, but this time the miller's daughter said she had nothing left to give him.
Then promise, when you are queen, you will give me your first child.
Knowing she had no choice, the miller's daughter agreed. And the next morning, the king saw the enormous room full of gold. He kept his word and made her his queen. A year later, the young queen had forgotten all about the queer little man. But as she nursed her new baby, the door opened.
Guess who?
Then she remembered her promise. The young queen was horrified. She offered him all the riches she possessed, anything to let her keep her baby. Seeing her tears, the little man was moved.
I will give you 3 days to find out my name. If you do, you may keep the child.
On the first day, the queen sent messengers far and wide to find every name in the kingdom.
Is it Caspar? Melchior? Lionel?
But the little man just shook his head.
No, that's not my name.
On the second day, the queen's messengers brought names from far-off lands.
Is it short ribs? Big britches? Or a cupcake?
The little man's answer was always the same.
No, that's not my name.
Then, on the third day, as the queen was about to lose hope, a messenger returned with a strange tale. Deep in the mountains, he spied a strange little man who leapt around his fire chanting,
Today I brew, tomorrow bake, then the queen's own child I take. This guessing game she'll never win, for my name is Rumpelstiltskin.
That night, when the little man came, the queen was waiting.
A promise is a promise. My name or your child?
Could it be Simon?
Scarcely.
Harry?
Hardly.
Tarquin?
Not in a month of Sundays.
The little man clapped his hands in glee.
I have won! The child is mine!
But the queen just smiled.
One more guess. Could it be, Rumpelstiltskin?
At the sound of his name, the little man let out a wail. He ran off into the night and was never seen again.
The Water of Life. Long ago in Spain, 3 brothers and their sister lived in a cottage in the countryside. Their life was simple and full of happiness, and they loved each other dearly. They worked very hard, and after a time earned enough money to build themselves a most beautiful palace. Folk travelled from all around to admire its grandeur. "Bonita, bonita!" they all cried, all except one frail old woman.
It truly is lovely, but something is missing. It needs a place of worship.
The brothers and sisters pondered her words, and then set to work and built a fine church. Again folk came from everywhere to marvel at the beauty of their labours. "Mucho bonita!" they all cried, all except one frail old man.
It is a marvel, but something is still missing.
The old man explained that for the castle to be a truly happy one, they needed to find a pitcher of the water of life, a branch from the tree of everlasting beauty, and a talking bird. Aware of the dangers of the journey, the sister asked the old man for some way to see that her brother was safe. The old man gave her a long knife and some advice.
Watch this knife carefully. If the blade is bright, all is right. If the blade is bloody, things have gone muddy.
The eldest brother was determined to go into the remote mountains to find these things. By and by, he met a giant and asked if he was on the right path. The giant confirmed he was, but added some words of warning.
"When you reach the crest, there will be many stones that shout curses at you. You must take no notice, and whatever you do not turn to look at them. Only by doing this will you be safe."
The eldest brother continued up the mountain, and as he reached the crest, he did indeed come upon a large pile of stones. And just as the giant predicted, they swore and scoffed at him.
"You backward peasant! You leave our flags!"
He tried to ignore their mockery, but the eldest brother could feel his temper rising. He reached down and picked up a handful of stones to hurl at them, but the moment he turned to take aim, he instantly changed into stone. Back at the palace, his brothers and sister watched the knife turn red with blood. The middle brother now vowed to find the water of life and to return their eldest brother safely. He too walked for many days. He too heard the words of the giant. He too tried to ignore the tirade from the insulting rocks. And then, when he heard his brother's voice amongst them, "Get away from here, you idiot!" he turned to look. At once, he too was turned to stone. At their home, the long knife again turned red. And again, the younger brother rose to the challenge. He walked, he listened, he tried to ignore the taunts of the rocks, but alas, his fate was to be sealed in stone as well. When she saw the blade become red again, the sister knew it was her turn. By the time she reached the rocks, the noise was tenfold. So many souls had lost their freedom, but the sister would not turn. She marched right past her brothers, who yelled their worst at her. "Your head's like a pumpkin, your breath's like a toad's." She paid no heed and walked on. At the top of the mountain, she found the pool of the water of life, from which she filled her pitcher to the brim. Nearby, she found the tree of everlasting beauty, from which she snipped off a branch, and into her cage flew the talking bird. So heavy were her treasures that as she made her way back past the screaming stones, a few drops of the water of life spilled onto the ground, and as it touched the stones, something miraculous occurred. The evil spell that imprisoned the souls was broken. The stones turned back into human forms. News of the courageous young woman travelled fast. The grounds of the palace filled with people who came to pay tribute, and among them was the king's son. Much as he admired the water of life, the tree of everlasting beauty, and the lively chatter of the talking bird, he most admired the beauty and strong heart of the young woman whose acts had bestowed freedom to so many people. And as for the frail old woman and her request for a church, well, let's just say she must have known it would one day be the perfect place for the most wonderful of weddings.